Here is Pennonia Balaton Blue. This is a light blue that shades to purple some. This purple can be seen in the chromatography at the bottom. There is a little change in tone as paper changes, but only slight, and it does shade a lot. Thankfully, as this ink does need it. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this gets much deeper into the page than you would really expect for how light it is, making this not so good for students. Also, I experienced flow issues, making me prime the pen more than once during the writing sample, a definite problem if you're a student taking notes in class. This is the flow issue that I really would make this a hard pass for me. The flow issue and constantly stopping breaks everything I'm doing and thinking about in writing. Add to that sometimes it gets a little too light in tone of a blue for me. So no, I don't want a bottle of it.
The pen for today is a TWSBI Mini. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here on the bright white paper, we see this very nice light blue that doesn't feather and it doesn't spread. It does have some touches of shading going on. And if you look at the darkest areas, you might just see that tiny hint of a purple undertone like in the A, but not any kind of a real thing about it. Mostly coming as a very light blue that is decent on this bright white paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Bubblegum. Here is Pennonia Dungo Wasp.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Really an unfortunate thing to see happen because even lighter as a light blue could be a problem. Now it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does have some shading, but it's not huge. Look at relations on the third line. Most of it is a very light word. The bottom of the L into the A is a little bit darker. The bottom of the T with that I is a little bit darker, as is the S. But most of the word is just too light, and I wouldn't want to see a whole page of that. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is a whole lot lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, also being affected by the tone of the paper, looking much more as a green-leaning turquoise. It's a translucent ink, not an issue, but know what you're going to get when you write on toned papers. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. This would not be what I was really in for on this ink. It just leaves me a bit disappointed, but it's not really the ink's fault. It's my preference on tones. Be aware of the color shift for toned paper. Looking at the back of the page, we get no problem for ghosting. Only a couple of spots that it got a little deeper into the page. They're not going to be a problem. You could write back here if you wanted.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we can see the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade. Look at mentioned on the second line where the end of the M into the bottom of the E is a little bit darker, lighter at the top of the E. The N gets a slight bit darker, the T much lighter, but the I is dark, the O-N lighter again, where the ED do get a bit darker. See, it's there. It's not huge, but it's there. It does not stand out against this quad rule well enough for me. It is a bit harder for me to read because I see both the writing and the quad rule at the same time. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting. We do have a couple of spots that got a little deeper into the page. Not a problem, just a warning sign. I would still be writing on the back of this page.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Colorverse Saturn V. Here is KWZ Azure number 5. Here is Organic Studios Jules Verne Nautilus Blue.
Here is Sailor Studio 540.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Much more of an issue in reading with the quad rule than it was even on the Clairfontaine because of that lighter and flatter tone. The lighter and flatter tone, much more product of the paper than the ink. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread, gives little bits of shading. It's the fact that this is hard to read with the quad rule that makes this not a good choice for students. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Geherbon Rose Tendresse. Here is Diamine Blaze Orange.
Here is Vinta La Union.
Here is Pilot Mixable Yellow.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is just a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, really being a light powdery blue here with very light feathers that occur in only a couple of spots. The spread is minimal and livable. The tone on this paper is where I really have a problem. It does shade, but with shading comes tiny feathers. Looking at the back of the page, ghosting's not a big problem. Deep into the paper is a problem. I would not write back on the back of this page because I feel like I would lose both sets of notes, but none of this bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The dry fine of the TWSBI Mini really exploited flow issues for this ink. It gives a generally light shade of blue with a touch of shading. Off camera, to get over the flow issues, I tried this in a wet fine, and it solved the flow issues for this ink. It darkened the tone of the writing a bit, but not a bunch. Just definitely darker, and it still shaded really well. Now, for me, the only option for this ink is a wet fine or a wet medium. Must have a wet pen to prevent the flow issues that I was having during the writing samples. Unless you enjoy priming your pen while writing, then go for it with a dry pen.